Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Hello. It's hard to believe we're in our home stretch here, our last afternoon on either day two or the end of our conference, no matter how you frame it. Delighted to be back. We've had a lot of nourishment today. We've had nourishment of human connection. We've had the nourishment of our kind of collective energy. We've had the nourishment of the workshops that we've just went to and the knowledge and the things that we've learned there. And we had the nourishment of some really amazing stories that we've heard from the stage and also probably in the workshops as well. So I'm feeling full in kind of a good, wholesome way, which is lovely. We're going to talk now about the nourishment of space and how space can also be a source for inspiration, a source for joy, happiness, compassion, so many things that we want to bring to the workplace. You may remember from Sue Ashford's talk yesterday, she was talking about some of the key things that people who are entrepreneurs have to think about as they think about space, not having an actual office to go to, but how do you create that sense of space for yourself? How do you self-manage that for yourself? But space in general is a really important thing for us to consider as we think about kind of who we are at work and how we show up and how we kind of create and embody that physical space. Sue talked about it like 4 different ways of connection in the workplace that you strive for. One was people, one was routines, one was purpose, and the other one was place. And so we're really excited to have Jeffrey here with us today to talk about place and the nourishment of place and the nourishment of space and how we can intentionally think about space. Jeff is principal with Steelcase, working with applied research and consulting, and we're delighted to have Jeffrey join us this afternoon. Welcome, Jeffrey.
There we go. Happy Friday. So as Chris mentioned, I'm with Steelcase. It's a very global audience, so I'll take a couple minutes later and talk a little bit about Steelcase, but I wanted to start out the session today with a story. And I don't know about you, but every once in a while I have one of these seminal events or something that just triggers an aha moment when you sit back and think, it's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that situation before, and it starts to kind of adjust your thinking about what's going on in the world. This happened to me probably 3 or 4 years ago. I had an opportunity to be out at Starbucks. And for those of you that don't know, Starbucks is headquartered out in Seattle. They work and live in an existing building that was probably, I think, built around the early 1900s. It had been renovated. The interior is gorgeous. So when you see all these different floors, they still have the same hardwood floors. And what the designer did, which I thought was really interesting, was in a couple of spaces on each floor, and I think the building's about 8 stories, they built these little work cafes. I don't know if they called them that, but they're a little work cafe, place from, at least from the design programming, it was a place for collaboration. In my world, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes, but what we hear a lot from our clients is around we want to be more innovative and we want to be more collaborative, right? So they had this idea, why don't we build this little work cafe and we're going to be really collaborative and we're going to create a little kitchen in the back, have all the materials that any of our employees could make any of the Starbucks drinks that we could make, anything from a black cup of coffee to a caramel macchiato frozen with 2 things of nutmeg and whipped cream and all that, right? So they've got this beautiful kitchen. Then strangely enough, as I walked the building, on the 2nd floor, they had a Starbucks. And it's exactly like you would see a Starbucks, like you walked into one of the 50 Starbucks in downtown Manhattan. So they've got baristas, they've got all the drinks that you can imagine. And I talked to somebody and said, why would you build a Starbucks in a Starbucks? They said, well, the intent was we want to try some new drinks, we want to prototype some stuff, and we've got a really, hopefully, friendly audience with our 500-600 employees in the headquarters building. And so we use it mostly to let people kind of experience their own drinks and give us feedback. What was interesting was, as you walked around the building, the little cafes that you could get the self-service drinks, you see maybe somebody come in and get a cup of coffee, somebody maybe sit down for a minute. Most people got in, walked away. Not many people at all. You walk to the cafe, it looked like, again, a Starbucks in downtown Manhattan, 15, 20 people in line, probably sat 60 or 75 people, all the seats were full. Like in a Starbucks, some people not drinking coffee, just sitting on their computer, other people having small meetings, one-on-one meetings like this. What was really interesting and what created that aha moment is in the work cafes, the self-service cafes, there's no charge. It's a nice employee thing that Starbucks did for them. When you use the Starbucks cafe, you pay for it, the same way you would pay for Starbucks any place else you would go. So I asked the people, I said, why would you pay for Starbucks coffee that you could walk 50 feet and get for free? And they said, well, there's two things that came out of that. One was they wanted a curated experience. So they wanted a barista to make them a nice cup of coffee or something that they wouldn't take the time to make on their own. More importantly, what they said is, Bob knows that Kevin goes down to get his latte every day at 2:30. And he knows he can either schedule time with Bob or try to get on his calendar, or he can meet Bob in line. And they can grab their coffee and they can sit here for 5 minutes and resolve business issues. And they've developed this pattern of knowing when people that are critical to them might be there, and they make their own arrangements to set up these little informal gatherings. So what was interesting to me is that not only had Starbucks invested in the experience, but employees had invested in their own experience. So that's one of the things that I want to talk a bit today about, that culture and experiences matter, probably more so than any time in, I think, our industry. So those of you that don't know Steelcase, maybe you've seen our trucks on the road. We're the largest manufacturer of commercial office furniture. U of M is a great customer of ours. I've been with Steelcase over 30 years. I hate to admit to that. But one of the things that I find really interesting with Steelcase is I can kind of look at the pattern of where we were as a company and where we are as a company by looking at the back of our trucks. So if you see the tagline on the back of our truck, this is a fairly recent truck for us, and it says, transforming the ways people work. Now, when I started with the company, if you looked at the back of the truck, it said, quality office furniture. If you went to Grand Rapids, people would talk about our product by standing on work surfaces or in pedestals and talk about no weight limits, whoops, there we go. No weight limits, things like that. Then we became the office environment company. Now we talk about transforming the ways people work. And so I want to set context before I talk about what we're doing today and the way that we think about helping organizations transform by taking you back a bit. Anybody want to venture a guess who this is? These are the heads of the military. This is the Army Chief of Staff, Navy Chief of Staff. And the reason I bring this up is 25, 30 years ago, organizations were built very much on a militaristic way to operate. And space was a bit the same way. So if you looked at an org chart, you'd have the general at the top, you have majors, captains, lieutenants, and they have the privates on the bottom. And if you were a general, you were lucky enough to get space that looked like this, right? The mahogany office. And if you were at the bottom end of that, if you were private, you ended up in a cubicle, right? So what's interesting is organizations at that point, and a lot of organizations today, are still very much organized around this militaristic, hierarchical sort of organizations. The challenge is, as the world has changed dramatically, so it's around technology, it's around demographics, new generations coming to work, they've got a different concept around what they value and where they want to work than ever before. The world has changed dramatically. So it used to look like this before, now the org chart looks way more like this, right? So it's gone from hierarchical to matrix to network. It's less about teams, it's more about groups and teams that work in different ways, together, apart, whatever. And people work everywhere, right? So this is a shot of a scene in Paris when I was there once on business. And here's a lot of millennials that are sitting working, right? This is their context. And so work has not only become different in terms of how it's done and how technology impacts it, but work has now gone from an 8 to a 24-hour day, right? With technology and mobility, you can work all the time. And this is not me, but it could be 3 in the morning. All of a sudden you realize you forgot to send that email or you get pinged by somebody in Singapore. And what do? It's like this hypnotic thing. You pick up your phone and you have to stare at it. So the context of work and how work gets done has changed dramatically. The one thing that hasn't changed that dramatically is the office environment. And so now what we're seeing is the real estate world that is starting to think about, well, with all this mobility, and if I walked around most offices, I would see, and statistics now will tell you, if you looked at cubicles in most commercial office environments, they're occupied less than 40% of the time, which means either people are working in teams, working in conference rooms, working at Starbucks, working in a library. We haven't had an office in Detroit for probably 5 or 6 years, so either work at home, work at the airport, find someplace to go. But the response to that by most organizations is, if nobody's sitting in this, we ought to take it away. In fact, why do we need cubicles at all? Why don't we just put huge benches and let people sit out there? And so what's happening is, as people start sitting in this type of environment that's very much a real estate efficiency model, they're finding that it's a really, really difficult place to work. And so what you see, and I get this article about probably 4 or 5 times a week, right? This is out of Wired magazine. And this is basically saying that open offices are the devil's creation, right? And so one thing I would suggest, if you want to read a really good book that I think is going to be kind of launch a different view about concentration, privacy, deep work, it's a book by Cal Newport. And he's actually a programmer that teaches at Georgetown. He wrote this book around how the kind of pendulum has shifted in the world of work to being all about collaboration, all about working together. And we're missing the fact that people need to concentrate, people need some level of really deep work. And so I think the pendulum's up here, it's starting to swing back again, and I think you're going to see the environments changing a lot. I'll show you some ideas of what that might look like. The other thing is Jim Hackett, who some of you may know. He was our CEO for a while. He was athletic director here for a little bit, and now he's CEO at Ford. Got us on this idea of systems thinking. Anybody know a lot about systems thinking or have heard the concept of that? So it's really thinking about any sort of organization environment as being the sum of a lot of different parts that people don't think about. And so one of the things that we're seeing is organizations, especially at a leadership level, are starting to think about the organization in terms of culture, in terms of space, in terms of process, in terms of tools, technology. And so they're thinking about how do you use that systems thinking approach to think not only about organizational effectiveness, but to think about how the environment in the work experience might be different. So moving from disconnection to interconnectedness, to circular, to emergence, the things that you can see up here. And this is why you're starting to see environments that look a bit more like this, right? So this is Quicken Loans in downtown Detroit. You can see much different type of environment than you normally see. And this is, I was talking to Chris a little bit earlier, this is WeWork. Anybody heard of WeWork? So WeWork, if you've not heard of them, is basically co-working space developed by an architect out in New York, probably 4 or 5 years ago. And they started leasing Class B space that people had given up on the lease, and so they started doing secondary leases on this, and then creating these co-working facilities for people like myself that have no office, or for organizations that want to use space on a temporary basis. Last time I heard, the market value of WeWork was somewhere around $20 billion. I'm not sure where exactly that comes from. They're actually losing money every year, but they believe long-term they're going to become not only for kind of mobile workers, but they're also going to take over portfolios for large customers also and develop environments specifically for them. So this is a bit about what our group does. The easiest way to think about us is we're really the customer-facing part of our research organization. So even though we manufacture furniture, our world, we look at it much more about the world of workers, and workplace. And so I've been with the company for about 30 years, have a background in design. I've been with this group for about probably 15 or 16 years. And so the work we do, I think, is really, really interesting. And what we use is what we call a work experience model. This is sort of a microcosm of what a systems model might look like. And so we talk about organizational drivers, which are things like process, what drives the way things happen, and around culture and behaviors, the way people operate and how work actually gets done. And then there's enablers in the environment, and those would be things like tools, could be technology, digital, analog, a variety of other things. And then there's space or place. Space is something that might be corporate owned, but we're seeing more focus on place, which could be your home, could be Starbucks, as people get more detached from the organization and work in a variety of different places. What's interesting, though, is as we work with a lot of corporate leaders, we find that the central part of that, which is really around what are they trying to accomplish to be successful as an organization, their focus has shifted dramatically away from what it used to be in terms of space to what it's becoming now. We're going to talk a bit about that. So why do we care about that? Deloitte does an interesting study every year, which is around human capital trends. They just released their report for 2019 this week. If you looked at it probably 4 or 5 years ago, they would talk about, and this is a study done with organizational leaders, about what do they lose sleep over, what's really important to them, and how well equipped do they feel to solve for that. They used to talk a few years ago about culture and engagement together. Then they separated the two because both were equally important. The last couple of years, they started talking about employee experience. And this year, they've transferred that or transitioned that into human experience. And so what we're seeing from corporate leaders, they talk about organizations of the future, organizational redesigns, moving from hierarchy to network. But they're talking about how do they think about employees and how do they think about attracting employees and keeping employees through creating a better employee experience. What I think is interesting, when they have the 5 key things that they talk about, look at the ones that are highlighted. Half of those are around culture and some sort of environmental issue, right? So we're seeing a much bigger, I think, focus on the part of leaders to think about what role does culture and space intertwine have within the organization to create this great employee experience. And it's not just an altruistic thing. You can see here a lot of data up here, but all you need to take away from this is that organizations that invest heavily in employee experience are more profitable, roughly 4 times as profitable as those that don't. And you can see on the bottom that organizations that invest in this, 28 times more likely to be on Fast Company's most innovative companies, 11.5 times as often in Glassdoor's best places to work, and so forth. And they also outperform in the stock market. So if you look at this, the S&P index, you can see that Fortune best companies to work for outperform Glassdoor and then Experiential. So CEOs are looking at that and saying, it's not only a good thing to do because it's the right thing for employees, but it's also better for us financially. We're more profitable because of that. So what we're seeing is organizations are starting to think about how do we switch the language from one of talking just about finance, which is the way organizations tend to run today, around the bottom line and strategic decisions made around finance, to thinking about what's the language about culture. And how do we think about culture in the same sort of strategic conversation that we might think about finance? And so let's talk a little bit about definitions. And if you look at Google or look at Amazon around books around culture, you'll find 80,000 books. And everybody's got a little different perspective around culture, but for our purpose today, let's talk about, if you get to the bottom line, it's really around how things happen or the way things work within organizations. At a deeper level, it's much around beliefs, assumptions, values, and the way people interact. But at the end of the day, it really directs people in terms of how they behave and how things happen. The other part of that, though, is, and what we're starting to discover is when we talk to organizations about cultural change or aligning culture and strategy, a lot of CEOs say, I don't want you to change my culture. I like my culture. It's a friendly place to work. It's a family-like place to work. When I'm out sick, I know I'm going to get 2 or 3 phone calls from people that are really concerned about me. And they view that as what the culture represents, yet they will also talk about we're not innovative enough, we're not doing the right sorts of things from a behavioral perspective. So what's really interesting is both need to coexist at the same time, but they are a bit different. In a lot of organizations, if you're really family-oriented, if you're really friendly, if everybody has a great relationship, it also can be a bit of a barrier because people tend to criticize or tend to provide constructive input less because they're afraid they're going to hurt people's feelings. So the challenge with a lot of organizations is to think about how do you retain the best of the culture around family, friendly place to work, that sort of feeling, but how do you separate the behaviors that tend to drive the organization from a performance standpoint? So this is a really common model that came out of MIT a number of years ago. It's called the iceberg model. I'm sure anybody involved with HR has seen this before. And it really talks about the 3 different layers that you see within organizations. What most organizations see and what they reflect on is the top of that, the stuff that's visible. It's around language, it's around what you see, it's around casual Fridays, it's around what the environment looks like. What CEOs are looking for is the other 2 layers. It's more around norms, behaviors, and patterns and the underlying values and beliefs that happen. And so the interesting thing about this is the things that have the most visibility, which are the artifacts and practices, are the lowest impact in most organizations. So when they start thinking about that strategy conversation, CEOs are starting to think about this gap between, from a strategy perspective, what organizations can do and what they must do to be successful. And the same would be true of the culture piece. What organizations feel like from a culture perspective and where they need to be successful. And as you start to think about the cross-link of those 2 strategies, that you really need to consider both, and those 2 really need to be interrelated, which is what our group tries to help organizations do. If you don't get that, what you have is a culture gap. You have aspirations around strategy, but if the culture doesn't support that and behaviors don't support that, it creates a drag on the organization. So the other thing we hear a lot about, and it's really kind of closely linked to culture, is the idea of engagement. So there's a lot of engagement studies out there. In engagement, if culture is how things get done, engagement is how people feel about how things get done. And what's really interesting is Gallup did a survey a couple years ago, and they talked about all the financial value of having engaged employees, especially now when the marketplace is so competitive. Go talk to Ford, GM, or Chrysler about how hard it is to attract engineers to work for them, right? Everybody wants to go to the West Coast. So Ford in their engineering department has got tons and tons of open spots because it's really difficult to pull people in. And so there's, from an engagement perspective, there's a huge financial value, the things you can see on the left, but if you look at the statistics, less than a third of employees in the US are engaged in their job. And engagement would be just basically doing enough so that I continue to work there. It's not the people that say, I'm happy to come in on the weekend or I'm happy to work overtime. Those are the highly engaged employees. Most are not right now. And so that's a big issue with companies is how do they get those engagement scores up? And what's interesting is in my generation, it would have been more about position status and salary. With millennials and now Gen Z that are entering the workforce, it's about feeling like I add value, feeling like I'm connected to purpose, feeling like I'm mentored, feeling like leaders want to see me do well and coach me in the organization. So their needs are quite a bit different. We did a study about 2 years ago with IPAS, and it was a global survey around how people felt about the value of the workplace, the work experience in terms of engagement. And what's interesting is there was a direct correlation to, as people felt more positive about the places that they worked, their engagement scores went up also. So there's a direct relationship to the environmental part of that also. So let's talk about a case study. And this is a really iconic brand. I bet I could put this picture up and you would know who the brand is. Anybody want to guess? Lazy Boy. Anybody know much about Lazy Boy? Started in 1927, and actually until 1965, I think it was, that was not only their primary, but almost their only product in the marketplace. So they survived for 40-some years only with the Lazy Boy chair, the Lazy Boy recliner. And in the last few years, they've shifted dramatically. So you will see their ads a couple times a year. And this is Kurt Darrow. Kurt's their CEO. And so when I met Kurt was talking about the changes that they needed to make as an organization as the demographics of people that bought their product had changed dramatically. So he said, here are the things that we're doing as a company that are dramatically different than what we used to do. Right now, we're changing our whole marketing approach and our product development approach. So it's no longer the 35-year-old single guy that sits in his recliner and watches football games that thinks innovation is putting a refrigerator in the base of it. So he doesn't need to get up at halftime, right? And he's codenamed, by the way, Bubba. They talk about Bubba as sort of the code name for that 35-year-old single male. And now it's the female, 35 years old, maybe married, maybe not, but is trying to do something different. So you see the tagline for Lazy Boy. This is one, live life comfortably. The other is, we help you convert a house into a home, right? Brooke Shields was their corporate spokesperson for about 6 years. You will now see, I saw the first ad today, that Kristen Bell is their new corporate spokesperson. So you're going to see a bunch of ads coming out shortly with Kristen Bell. So if you want to buy Lazy Boy products, you can go to one of 400 and some Lazy Boy stores. So they're branded stores. You'll see them all over the US. But you can also go to a typical furniture store and they have Lazy Boy boxes within a box. So it will be a branded environment within a general furniture store, or you can, some stores just buy Lazy Boy products that might be scattered around. So this is a big transition for Lazy Boy. This is Lazy Boy's headquarters. This is the original factory that's down on Telegraph. If you don't know the Detroit area, there's a road that's about 50 miles long that starts north of Detroit, goes all the way to the Ohio border. This is towards the Ohio border. And this is their headquarters. And when you walk through the building, this is what it looked like. And so the fact that it was a factory meant immediately that it had a lot of segmented spaces. So leadership sat in the front of the building. Nobody knew if they were there or not. Different departments sat in different parts of the building. We're totally isolated. When we started to do some workshops with people, we found that there were people that had worked there for 10 or 15 years that had never met each other before, right? And so one of Kurt's big focuses was to think about how this new workplace, this new building, could become an accelerator for a new and different culture within the organization. So he actually came to us. They had already decided after looking at all the furniture companies that it didn't matter to them. As long as pricing was about the same, they didn't care. That hurt our feelings, but it was the reality of the marketplace. But he said was, what we're looking for is somebody to help us through this change. We need somebody to help us move from this culture to this culture. I'll tell you what I want the organization to do, but I'm not sure I know what to do with the culture. And so the question we posed to Kurt was, what if the metric for the building, instead of being around building cubicles, building conference rooms, and having this really nice environment, what if the metric was to improve business performance? How would you measure the building differently, and how would you design the building differently? As a designer who's used to programming things around how many people, that's the number of cubicles, and let's build some conference rooms, that's a much different way to think about space. So the process really quickly, again, we have kind of a short window of time here, but it really focused on doing a cultural assessment initially with the 500 people that were going to take occupancy in this building. What was interesting is, as we did that assessment and starting to roll this out to the leadership team, Kurt said, this is too big an issue for us just to think about the headquarters building. It's about the entire organization. So they ultimately did an assessment for all 8,000 employees globally for La-Z-Boy, right? Because they said it's not just about the headquarters, it's about changing the culture of the organization. We spent a lot of time with the leadership group, helping them build alignment around strategies. So what was their strategic intent and what were they trying to do over the next 5 years? And what are the new behaviors that they thought needed to emerge from that? We helped them focus on 4 or 5, I'll show you in a minute. And then we did a lot of workshops that I'll show you in a minute with the employees to both share the leadership vision so we could start to socialize that, but also to get their input around what they thought about that and what they thought about the future of the work that they needed to do within La-Z-Boy. And then we did some things around building a prototype and then moved it to the design phase. So I'm going to show you a little bit of all this. So one thing I thought was really interesting is after we did this global survey, a lot of companies, when you talk to them about culture, will say, well, culture is different all over the place, right? So we have subcultures and we've got locations globally. So each location is going to look and feel a bit different. This is their global survey. The only difference here, the different colors represent people that had been there for different periods of time. So what's interesting is you see the red bar that's a little bit higher. Those were the people that had been at La-Z-Boy for less than a year. What was interesting to me is the pattern matched the rest of the people, right? So they picked up on the culture really quickly. The only thing was they were more optimistic. They rated everything a little bit higher than if you'd been there for a while. So really interesting that regardless of where you are, location, the culture tends to reach out and impact everybody in a very, very similar way. So really quickly, cultural strengths. See some things around about the people. Leaders understood the value of people, which was great. Talk about pride and brand and quality. So a lot of tenure within La-Z-Boy. Most of them had been there 10, 15, 20 years and really believed in the mission of the company. They talked about being aligned and focused as an organization and also around inclusivity, but being very inclusive and asking for people's opinion on things. And then learning and continuous improvement. What we helped them focus on is how would they think about raising the level of some things that they were concerned about with culture. So around discipline and operational excellence. Like a lot of companies, they were good at inventing ideas, pretty good at developing them, not as good at implementing them, right? So the more they had to work across platforms, across different groups, the more trouble they had in getting things moving quickly and efficiently. So part of that was around communication, around transparency. People were sometimes confused about the direction of La-Z-Boy, what was on Kurt's mind. And a lot of that was lack of physical presence. They never saw him. And they were trying to use technology to move communication around. And there was also an issue around collaboration. A large part of it was the building was so segmented, people didn't see each other. So we tried to help them with that, and then speed and a sense of urgency across the whole organization. So these are sort of the general areas that we help them with: risk, trust, collaboration, engagement, and discipline. So when we focused them in, these were the things that were really aspirational in vision to them. And I'll let you read through these quickly. But it was around the transparency and trust, around a safe environment for dialogue and debate, making people comfortable that it's okay to feel like I can critique somebody's idea without them taking it personally. Around sharing interaction, you can see the rest of these that are up here. We also, one of the things we do is model building within our workshops. And so what we did is take the ideas that we had around transparency or some of those other aspirations and said, how would you build an environment that would help support that? Not asking them to build furniture, not asking them to be literal in what they build, but to give us some conceptual ideas. What might that look like? What might that feel like? What's really interesting, and we see this consistently when we work with employees, is these are 4 different models with 4 different groups. And can you see the similarity? They almost always build a centric model. There's something in the middle, which almost represents, if you think back around how towns were originally built and they had sort of a center to the town, they didn't have an internet, they didn't have phones, so they had to go to the middle of the town to get information that would be posted. They always built something that was in the center, and then they built out around that. So if you took that and then started to think about this now to future, so if we're here, where do we want to be in the future? They developed this aspirational view of what that might look like. Private offices to spaces that leadership could share vision and transparency. Design that reflects status as opposed to a design that reflects internal and external brand. And then we took this and made a bit of a literal model out of it. So this was an interpretation of all the models. I think we did a total of probably 8 workshops with employees. And this is what they all said collectively, right? So you sort of see this idea of a social space in the middle, kind of radiating out to more open and private spaces, to areas where teams could work. So none of this was reflective on the organizational structure. It was reflective on the work that was being done. And then for each of the principles, I'm not going to go through these, but for each of these, we developed not only an idea of what would a spatial principle be, but what would the culture go along with that? What should leadership be thinking about doing to try to accelerate the movement of work to help support the organization at a higher level? And then we gave them some quick visuals of what that might look like. And then we built a prototype. What's interesting, I'll show you a quick idea of the prototype. But this was a lot of different spaces that would represent what the whole headquarters building would look like. But look what happened immediately. So this is a small work cafe. Over on the left-hand side, that's an IT group that was working together, and it was a marketing team that was sitting alongside them. And they started this dialogue. I was just sitting there watching. They started to talk about, how could we do something different with a web page that would help us, right? These people would never have been together, but they found this casual collaboration was really helpful for them. And look at the level of interaction. So some people would look at that and say they're standing around socializing. What they were doing was standing around getting to know each other and building knowledge networks, right? And so as they thought about that, Kurt got more and more excited about, let's try to make this more of a mobile environment. So it ended up that 70% of the environment was what you would call free address. So only about 30% of the people had an assigned space. Everybody else floats around the building. And the building ended up looking like this. So a bit of a transition from what you saw before, right? So I'm going to take you through some spaces really quickly. This is the original reclining chair that was developed and built in 1927, right? It's very cool. One of their design people down in North Carolina used to work for GE engines, and he said building a reclining chair is more complicated from an engineering perspective than building a jet engine, which I still don't get, but anyway, that's just outside the lobby to anchor them around where did they come from and what's that all mean. So let me just show you a few shots here. So the building's incredibly transparent. This is as you walk in. And if you look carefully, you can see right through the building. And this is what it looks like when you walk into the building. So this is a work cafe, right? So in the past, they used to have cafeteria-like food. Now they brought food services in. So now they're having pesto pizza and all this. More importantly, what they use it for is a collaboration area. And so you can see there's a combination of open areas, there's some private areas. You can see through the building horizontally too. And so that was really, it was really sort of a model for how they would think about transparency of information through transparency of space. Building trust. We didn't get to the leadership team fast enough. They were already pretty far in their development of the building in terms of building a third floor that was primarily private offices. But what they did do was make them all transparent, so they're all glass in front. And more importantly, what Kurt did was say, let's open it up to the rest of the employees. So employees were welcome to come up there and use it. As we expected, nobody did because it's the leadership floor, right? So as much as leaders say come up and work here, people rarely do. So what Kurt said after noticing that for a bit, he said, so what we need to do is go down to the employees. And so what they started to do was the 10 key leaders for the organization started going down to the cafe. And you can actually, Kurt is sitting over there in the corner. And so from whatever time he gets in the morning for the first couple hours, he goes down and he does all of his emails, the rest of the leadership team does. In about the first 30 days, the employees looked at that and said, what's Kurt doing down here? And Kurt made it a point to get up and go over and talk to people, sit down at the different tables and say, so what are you thinking? I'm thinking about doing this. What's your reaction to that? He said within 60 to 90 days, it just became the general way that business was done. That all leaders came down, and now everybody knows each other, and the trust is unbelievable. And information across boundaries, so there's about 150 spaces that some are reservable. You can reserve them for projects for long periods of time. Some are free address, so I can grab them quickly. But you can see there's 150 monitors throughout the building. Some are private, some are broadcasting information about what's going on at Lazy Boy throughout the day. And you get the same sort of feeling with the open space. So there's very little space that you would identify as being cubicles per se. There's a variety of different places you can work, some open, some private. There are some team rooms for groups that really need their own space. This is one of the product development and marketing teams. And most importantly, there's places for them to have dialogue. Those difficult meetings or those difficult times where you need a bit of privacy. Some are just more architecturally protected, so you don't necessarily need to build private rooms all the time to do that. Some are a bit more open, but private to some extent, and use a lot of their own furniture in the building. So again, you can see the transition of how open the space was. And trying to create a residential feel, this is the next sort of big trend we're seeing, is people want to work in a place that feels more like a house than it does an office building, right? So a lot of residential stuff coming in. We partnered with West Elm, all these residential companies to try to help create some of this. And they've got these little cafes around the building where you can stop and get a cup of coffee or just relax for a few minutes. So outcomes for the project. So we're still sorting through that. We're going to go and do some measurement now in terms of how spaces are being utilized in the next 6 months or so. But what Kurt will tell you is the trust between people is unbelievable. They've been there about 3 years now, and they still get 1 to 2 groups that come that want to visit the building and want to tour the building. So they get tremendous outside interest in what's going on with the building. They said, we still have people, we have college graduates that come in and say, I don't know what you do, but if you've built this kind of environment, you must care about employees. And so their ability to hire has gone up dramatically. So there's a lot of metrics that we're working on. There's a couple other projects on our website. We just did a new space for our IT group that's all about agile working that we've been measuring some of these things also. So you may want to look at that if you're looking for more case study information. So that's the story about Lazy Boy. And this says 0, so I'm a couple minutes over, but not too bad. Thank you.
Okay, we're coming down to the home stretch. I hope you're getting your infusion. Dean Guru talked about getting an infusion, and I hope you're getting it. And I also hope you'll take it out into the world. That session on random acts of kindness I thought was so important because, to my mind, we're living in a time right now where cynicism is the default. And if you don't actively push against it, it does take over. The times are so dark right now. And there's a quote I've always grabbed onto to help me think about the challenge of that. It's from Raymond Williams. And he said, to be truly radical is to make hope possible, not despair convincing. And I really think that is a powerful quote for what we're trying to do here. Our next session is about that, about how to build an organization that allows people to thrive when they come in to be their best. We have to pull an audible. Unfortunately, Steve Nelson, the CEO from United Healthcare, had an unforeseen complication in his schedule, so he couldn't be here. So we're going to hear from Bob Quinn, who's a professor emeritus here at the Ross School of Business. If you've heard Bob speak before, you know what a treat he is. I think of him almost like Yoda. He's this really deep person, really deep thinker, really wise person, but don't tell Ron I said this, but the real reason I said that is I'm hoping Yoda shows up on the picture for Bob over there. I have no idea if I can influence your artwork, but there's my attempt. Bob Quinn is going to talk to us about how to build an organization, give us the research on how to do it to allow people to thrive. Bob.
It's great to be with you. I'm a fanatic about taking notes, and so all through the conference I've written down almost everything I've heard, and I have a habit of putting stars next to the things that really grab me, and then lots of stars next to the things I think are most important. As I start today, I want to share with you what I think was the single most important thing I've heard at this conference. And the reason it's so important is it ties to words that Andy just said about the capacity to move from cynicism to hope and to build hope in other people. And the most important thing I've heard is a story that Scott Drew told us this morning. I came from a small town in North Carolina. No one left this town. I went to college. I got a job. And I thought that my role was to make powerful people happy. And so that's what I did, and I succeeded. And I was miserable. And then he says, I discovered agency. I found out who I was. And then I made decisions like, I'm leaving this job and I'm going to college, to graduate school. And the guy says, that's the worst decision you've ever made. And his response was, I don't care. See, Scott, from that moment on, was not determined by what was going on out there. He was determined from in here. He discovered his agency. For the last 18 years, Kim Cameron and I have stood over there in that executive education facility and taught thousands of executives about positive leadership. For 4 days, they sit on the edge of their seats. They get ideas like you've gotten in the last day and a half, and they soak it in. They love it. And then on Friday, I say, what are you going to go home and do differently? And they look like this. They become terrified. They're incredibly scared. They don't dare go home and try to implement the ideas that you've learned, because they know what the culture is like back there. And they know that they'll be laughed at, either directly or behind their backs. And they'll lose credibility. And they'll be alone. I've had at least 4 people come up to me at this conference and tell me an incredibly intimate story about their loneliness. And then changing. The concepts you've learned here are incredibly powerful. Many of you listen to them and you have a sense of not only inspiration, but calling. Many of you have talked to me about, I feel like this is my work. But you can't do that work unless you have what Scott talked about. I want to share with you 2 of the most profound notions I've uncovered in my career. And they have to do, in the end, with the question that changes everything. One question, and it changes everything. But you can't learn to ask this question unless you change how you learn. And that's what I want to talk about. I want to answer 4 questions. What is social excellence? What in the world is that? When do you see it? When you learn from it, what new question does it lead you to ask, and how does asking that question change everything? And so what? That's what I'd like to cover in the next few minutes. If you look at this diagram, in the middle of this diagram is a list. This list is a very, very important list. These are the fundamental assumptions that drive your life every single day. The organizations that we live in are driven by this list of assumptions. These assumptions come from social scientists who have done hundreds of thousands of studies. And they come back and say, here's what the world looks like. People are self-interested. People are rational decision makers. Resources are scarce. Conflict is inevitable. These are the fundamental assumptions of economics, of organization theory, of all the disciplines taught in this cathedral. We say, well, economics is a gloomy science, meaning they make these assumptions. Why in the world is this the case? Well, because these social scientists study you and I. And this is what they find. Because even though there's all positive people in this room, right here, just below here, is our first unconscious theory. And it's this theory. How many of you, when you left home this week, locked the door? Why'd you lock the door? That's a very sound thing to do. And from the time you could talk, and your mother said, because I said so, and if you don't eat half that plate, you're not getting dessert, that's a transaction. That's this model. And we learned it from the time we could talk. And the people we live with, in the organizations we work in, they live by this model. This is the dominant theory, even if it's not articulated. The result is that it's very normal for organizations to decay every single day. They move to the left. And when we move to the left, the dynamic changes. In the middle of that curve, we rely on the left brain. Our logic is linear. We solve problems by thinking about cause and effect. As we take these assumptions and live them every day, we do things like, these people, because you can't trust them, you've got to build a control system. And when you do, you know what people do? Yes, you do know. They resist. And when you resist, that's data for me. And I say, you know what? I need to build a better control system. Now that's called a vicious cycle. And it initiates other vicious cycles. And I can't solve that logic because what made me successful yesterday, when I apply it today, it gets worse. Something just turned upside down. That's what Einstein meant when he said you can't solve problems at the level at which they were created. You have to think at a different level. At the other side of this curve is the exact same dynamic turned upside down. It's a virtuous cycle. It just keeps getting better and better. That can't be understood from the middle of the curve either. Now what happens? We lose our communal focus. Priorities begin to compete between people. We see negative peer pressure in every organization. The pressure is not to perform. That's not just a blue-collar phenomenon. It's all the way to the top. People in the C-suite are terrified of deviating. That's why they come here and they get that look on their face on Friday. I can't go back to my company and introduce these ideas. They'll kill me. Micromanagement follows. The interactions become constrained. We begin to reproduce the past in everything we do. Control further intensifies. We avoid work. Conflict increases. We have isolated silos, and we burn resources. In our economy, we burn billions of dollars every day because of human ego. Does that side of the curve look familiar to you? Raise your hand if that's familiar. That's the reality we see every day. We see the middle of the curve and we see the left hand. That's our life. That's why you're here, looking for a whisper of hope. Now, scientists tell us human beings learn from failure. Scientific fact. Managers solve problems. They complete tasks. They solve problems. That's what managers do. In other words, managers are constantly trying to restore the order at the middle of that curve. That's what problem solving is. Now, the huge question is, what does the right side of the curve look like? Let's take a look. When we find social excellence, people are embracing higher purpose. We've heard that phrase a number of times this week. The vision is shared. We have so much rhetoric about vision. We often use the term shared vision, but the emphasis doesn't get placed on shared. The transformation that takes place every time as negative peer pressure becomes positive peer pressure. In a highly positive organization, everybody expects everyone else to excel, to give all they have. All of a sudden, everybody's working because they don't dare not work instead of blowing everything up. Incomprehensible concept, distributed leadership. That is, everybody's leading. We all know that's impossible. Authentic dialogue. We don't expect to have people talk to us authentically. We expect them to be running an agenda, to somehow manipulate us, to buy their product, to comply with whatever it is they're trying to get us to do. The co-creation of possibility. You know, we put people's names on their inventions and their pictures, whatever it is they produce, their intellectual property. And it's such an illusion because it's always co-created. Self-organization. The system organizes itself. We know that can't be. People spontaneously contribute. The learning is symbiotic. I had lunch with someone yesterday. It was spectacular. He said, well, I'm thinking about this. I've been working on this. I said, whoa, that reminds me of this. He said, I've never thought of that before. You put that with this. Wow, then there's... I said, whoa, that's exciting. At the end of the lunch, we were on fire. What was happening? That's symbiotic learning. Collective intelligence. In those classes, I use this term all the time. They all nod. They have no idea what collective intelligence is because you and I have been trained forever that intelligence is inside individual heads. It's measured by something called IQ. You go out and hire the smartest people, and then you have a great organization. That's not collective intelligence. The whole reason for these connections and the trust we've been talking about for the last 2 days is when you and I can sit at a table in complete trust and share our ignorance as well as our knowledge, heaven forbid, and speak authentically, we engage in symbiotic learning. The team has a capacity that doesn't exist in this meeting. Have you ever gone to this meeting? That's zero collective intelligence. That's the measure. Hence, we're constantly generating resources. Now, if you look at the right side of that curve, you get a knot in your stomach. You say, I'm having trouble with that. That's not what I experience. What I experience is this. That has to be kind of Hollywood or something. Now, I want to suggest to you that social intelligence occurs all the time. All the time. It particularly occurs in crisis. We had an executive from the federal government. He said to me, the happiest day of my life was 9/12. I said, what? He said, 9/12. He said, on 9/12, I didn't have a single bureaucrat working for me. I only had Americans. And what we accomplished was incredible. A stunning experience. If you work in the utility industry, different companies have different names for it. Most common, storm culture. Tornado comes through, rips up the state of Michigan. What happens at DTE? You find secretaries stopped on the road feeding electrical wire to linemen. You find people all over the company doing whatever it takes. 2 years ago, I was sitting at a table with one of their executives as he talked about the most recent manifestation of storm culture. Now, this is a utility executive. These are not soft people, right? There's tears literally running down his cheeks as he describes storm culture because it's so sacred to him. It's like a religious experience because he's seeing human nature at its very best. Downsizing. Usually we don't see it except for a few companies that decide not to downsize and say to their people, we're going to live or die with your self-organizing capacities. And all of a sudden we see social excellence. We most frequently encounter this in crisis. Now, when people experience it, they often have no cognitive apparatus to hold it. So what happens is they say, wow, and then they let it recede deep into their memory banks, way down deep. I think of a nurse on campus here who said, the highlight of my career, unquestionably, was I was on an interdisciplinary team of engineers, doctors. We were working on eliminating a major disease in the world. She said, when we walked in the door in the morning, we all checked our hats at the door. I wasn't lower than one of the doctors because I was a nurse. We were all equals, working on an incredibly important purpose. She said, highlight of my life. And then she had let go of it because what do you do with it? It was just, you're grateful it happened. Thank you. That is, we don't learn from social excellence except for a few people. They experience it and they can't let go of it. And they begin to focus on it. And then they ask a question that nobody else can ask. This is a big deal. Here's the question. I want to give you some examples. Richard Mahoney, CEO of Monsanto. He's got a little problem one day. He's not a very green person. The government has now, this is in the late 80s, the government has said, okay, we want measures, we've got to make reports. The first report comes to his desk, and he said, even I was ashamed. The numbers were so bad. And he had a news conference the next day to announce these numbers. And he was panicked. He said, I'll live in derision. The company will live in derision. I can't report these numbers. So what do you do in the next 24 hours? Well, he went home and stayed awake all night. He came in the next day and he said, at the press conference today, I'm going to announce the Monsanto Pledge. In the next 6 years, we're going to reduce our carbon footprint by 90%. Everybody in the room said, are you insane? That's impossible. It simply cannot be done. 1,000 explanations as to why. He said, I'm announcing today. He went to the press conference, he made the announcement. The media was so enamored with the pledge, they never paid attention to the bad numbers. And the short-term problem was solved. But that was the beginning, not the end of the story. Richard talks about the next 6 years as spontaneous teams all over the company formed spontaneously. Because they were so inspired that their company was going to do this. They began to behave in ways that reflect what I showed you in that last slide. He became obsessed with this. He began to study it. He began to talk to other business leaders. Some shook their heads, what are you talking about? A few of them knew what he was talking about. He formulated his own informal theory. In answer to the question, if this happens in crisis or in some extreme situation, what can I do to create it? Can it be created? Not long ago, I met an amazing man. He went to the first Gulf War, and at the start of that war, we had a crisis. The crisis was the army was prepared to fight in Europe, not in the desert. That meant all the equipment had to change, all the strategies, everything had to change, and there was no human mind that could manage that complex process. So all they could do is, hey, folks, do the best you can. His people did everything that needed to be done, and he was stunned. He was one of those people who couldn't let go of what he observed. For the next 12 years, he asked the question, how can leadership create social excellence? And he studied the leaders around him. He tells of one leader in particular, the guy with woodpecker lips. He said he had woodpecker lips. He demanded excellence in everything, and if you didn't get it, he tattooed your back with his woodpecker lips. He said, I was covered with tattoos. This guy was the toughest leader I ever met. Now, catch the next statement. And we loved him. Doesn't go together. Toughest manager ever, we loved him. Why do we love him? Because he always put our interests first. It was about our growth. Never ceased to demand excellence. It was about our welfare. Sounds strange. 30 years of research have shown, study after study, it's scientifically sound. The best leaders are high on task, very demanding, and high on people. They nurture people into discovering how to do the impossible. Scientific fact. Next Gulf War came. He went. He was now ready. The first thing he did was he had written a short paragraph about what a soldier is and does. A soldier's noble, never takes advantage of anybody. It read like a Boy Scout oath. And the moment you see the words, you say, this guy's insane. Why? Because you know, given the values of the Army, that when he walks in and hands them that paragraph, what are they going to do when he leaves the room? Come on. Laugh at him. We're smart enough to know that. He wasn't smart enough. No, it wasn't even smart enough. It was he didn't care because he had agency. But that's not all he did. He said, I treat every private with respect. And every officer and every non-commissioned officer will treat every private with respect, and will treat each other with respect. And then, he said, we will do everything with excellence. We will be better than every other battalion on every single measure. And what happened? They were better than every battalion on every single measure. All the way to things like PE scores, physical ed training scores, donations to charity, everything they measure. He said it was just expected that we be excellent. We got a lot of people from DTE. Stop any one of them and ask them the story of the last 10 years. In 2008, that company faced a crisis that everybody faced, called the recession of 2008. Jerry Anderson, CEO, didn't know what to do. So he said to his people, I think you know what to do. I don't, but you do. I don't know what to ask you to do. And 2009 was the best year in the history of the company. Jerry sat down with his direct reports the year after. And I was in the room 2 years ago when he went over this in detail with them, reviewing this history. But here's what he did. Here's what he asked them in that room. In the past year, our people performed in ways we could not have predicted. we could not have predicted. See, you can't predict social excellence. What should we learn from our experience, and how can we keep our employees performing that level, not due to crisis, but through our own leadership? Jerry was literally asking the question that changes everything. Most people never ask this question because they don't believe in social excellence. They can't articulate social excellence. The research that's driven the positive movement at Ross Business School is about some form of social excellence, individually, team, organization. It's about living on the right side of that curve. He then did a very interesting thing. Here's the 4 questions that followed. Question number 1. Look, this is our company. What do you want to make of it? You're a vice president. What do you want to make of this company? Question 2. What in your values and beliefs makes you care about creating that future? See the word belief. How many times has the word belief come up in the last 2 days? Because that's the center of the POS effort. It's about changing beliefs. Because people don't believe in what we're aspiring to. This cultural change stuff that we just talked about is about changing beliefs. You don't change culture until you change the beliefs. There are not many courses at business schools teaching MBAs how to change other people's beliefs. There are courses that are called leadership courses. They just don't teach you leadership. How would you describe that future in a vivid, tangible way that makes you concrete for you? How can we as a team align to make that future real? He then did an interesting thing. He said, take these 4 questions, go back to your office, spend an hour, and write an answer to each of these 4 questions. Then come back. I want you to share your answers. And they did. Now, this is 2010. Those answers turned into the new vision for the company. Since 2010, they've tripled their stock price. They became a best place to work. This is a utility company. Best place to work award. Impossible. And 5 or 6 other very impressive things. All right. I believe that understanding what I've said so far is very important. There's one question that changes everything. Most people never ask it. If you do ask it, it will change everything. The problem precedes the question. How in the world do we learn from excellence? I propose in the next few minutes to do a very strange thing. I'm going to do an abbreviated version of an exercise I do almost every time I teach now, usually the first 2 hours with people. And I'm going to try to do just a few minutes of this exercise. And here's how it would normally work. I would divide you into 4 sections, and I would say, you folks over there, your question is this. What's the difference between a good and a great conversation? Not a normal conversation, but a really good conversation and a great one. What's the difference? What's the difference between a good marriage and a great marriage? What's the difference between a good team and a great team? Good organization, great organization. Now we're going to do it a little bit differently, and I'm going to do it very fast. But here's you get 30 seconds to write an answer to this question. I want you to all do the same question. What is the difference between a good conversation and a great conversation? Write an answer. Okay, you have 30 more seconds. Convince the person next to you that you're right. Go. Now, I'm going to try to do a very difficult thing. I'm going to have a conversation with you. I'd like you to raise your hand, and I'll call on you, then yell out your answer. I'll repeat it. We'll make sure everybody hears every answer. I would like you, as you listen to other people answer, to keep a list. You either can write what they said or translate it into your own words if you like, but keep a list. The list's going to be important. Someone start me out. What word did you write down that you want to stick with here? Back there, nice and loud. A great conversation is very passionate. There's so much energy unfolding. Thank you.
Selfless.
Selfless. In a great conversation, both people have transcended ego. They're selfless. They're not running an agenda. They're not trying to manipulate each other. Great answer. There was a hand, someone, yes.
Mutual interest.
They become engaged. You know, we've had so many talks with total engagement, full engagement, high engagement. They're fully engaged. No one's trying to force them this. They are incredibly connected. Thank you. Yes. The trust is enormously high. I don't have to figure out what your agenda is. As we go on, we're trusting each other. We're more and more open. Yes, sir. There is positive energy being released in the exchange, right? It's a virtuous cycle. It's increasing, right? Good. Yes. There's vulnerability. In this cathedral, you arrive on the first day for your MBA program. The first thing you learn in the first conversation is, I need to be smart. And for the next 2 years, you pretend to be smart. You pretend you know everything. And it's terrifying. And then a horrible thing happens. You get a job. And they worship the same God, the God of knowing. And the notion of, here's what I don't know. When you're building collective intelligence, this is more crucial than what you do know. Vulnerability. Great answer. Thank you. Yes. Compassion and active listening. That word listening, we throw it out with such ease. But if I'm looking at Fritz and he's talking to me, do I understand his deepest needs and interests? Can I feel who he is? Empathy is an act of love. Did you hear what I just said? 4-letter word? Could be shot for that. Another one. Yes, ma'am. Connection. What does that mean, connection? Okay. So that empathy has turned into an enormous sense of mutual understanding and connection. I'm one with this person. And there was a... Say it again? Oh, change and share. Thank you. Beautiful. What a great answer. In this process, in real time, we are learning. That's called change. We are changing in real time because of the sharing. Thank you. Unconditional. What does that mean?
Like there is no limitation what you are going to discuss, and there is no set agenda about it.
Okay, so that I'm fully committed to this. I may not have been when the conversation started, but I sure am now. Yeah. Respect. I don't look down at this person. We have research that says we can predict if you're going to be married or not 10 years from now by whether or not you condescend. Right? It's equality. It's respect. It's honoring. This other person's not an object to be manipulated. It's a human being to be honored. Yes?
I think it's productive.
What an interesting statement. She says, it's productive. Stuff comes out of this. There's an artifact, right? And it's not just the learning. You walk away and say, oh, I'm not going to see you. You get on the bus, you disappear. 10 years later, you bump into the person. What happens? You throw your arms around them. This lasting relationship 10 years later, right? Because this was so sacred. Yeah, oh, okay. All right, yes,
Curiosity.
we're open. We're searching with each other. We're really engaged, right? Yes, Chris. What in the world is aliveness, Chris? It's buzzing. It's alive. It's this energy is there, right? Yeah. Ah, it's totally authentic, right? There's no on-stage behavior. Yes. It's equitable, absolutely, right? We're not, it's the nurse. You know, we checked our hats at the door. All right. So look at your list. It's a pretty interesting list. It's not about a static thing. It's about a dynamic thing. It's about a complex adaptive system called a conversation. Now, I want you to put on your imaginative hats and imagine that we went to the next three topics. And we made a similar list about the difference between a good marriage and a great marriage. There would be some things different. For example, in marriage, someone almost always talks about intimacy. Well, that would be different than a great conversation. But there's more than 80% overlap. So then we talk about a great team. Is there overlap? Absolutely. Great organization, there's overlap. We begin to see something when we have this conversation about these things, we begin to see some things we normally can't see. And it's really, really interesting. Because if I had a big whiteboard up here and captured everything you said and did the other three columns, it would be an interesting whiteboard. I would then ask you two simple questions. Number one, what is your definition of social excellence? And everybody writes something different, but you get some profound answers. But then there's a second very important question. How do you create social excellence? Make your list. Now, the interesting thing about that list, everybody in the room writes real answers that reflect real leadership. You transcend your own ego. You show respect and honor. Virtually everything you've talked about the last day and a half. Then I ask a question that shocks them. It's a very important question. I say, okay, we got all this stuff on these whiteboards. This is a theory of social excellence. Whose theory is it? And they go paralyzed. They don't know what I'm looking for. So I ask 3 or 4 times, and finally someone whispers, it's ours. I say, that's right. I haven't put up a single PowerPoint slide. All I did was ask you a question. This is your theory of social excellence, not mine. Now, another really profound question. Where did it come from? Because before you came in the room, you didn't have a theory of social excellence. Where did this come from? Here's the answer. It came from our suppressed experiences. You see, a great conversation may be one time in 1,000, but you don't have 1,000 conversations, you have 1,000,000 conversations. That means you often have bumped into this rare phenomenon called great conversation. You've seen some great marriages. You've seen some great teams. You've seen some great organizations. You've had enough experiences that you didn't learn from, tucked away down here, that when we have this conversation, you can put the input in. Not somebody else's input, it's your input. It's your observations. It's your, here's the key word, beliefs. You already believe in social excellence, you just don't know it. The moment you see that, something miraculous happens. What is it? you can believe. And if you start to believe that social excellence is real, then you can ask what? How can we create social excellence? See, when you go home and you try to talk to those other people back there that have never been here, they think you're insane. They know what you're talking about is impossible. They know it. They're sure. Because this theory, the one in the middle of the curve, which is right here, is what's dominating. Until there's a conversion to that second, deeper theory, now think Scott, I looked him in the eye and said, I don't care. I just declared my agency. I am now going to contribute the rest of my life. Scott, I'm going to live by purpose. And what happens to individuals in that scenario is what happens to organizations. We had 3 or 4 stories the last day and a half of real purpose-driven organizations. They were not living by convention. They were doing strange things. I think that this is critically important. Whoop. One of the most common things that I get asked by people who look like this is, I like these positive concepts, but you don't know my boss. Let me tell you about my boss. Let me tell you about the culture of my company. If only I could do this. If only. That's a statement of not having agency. That's a state of learned helplessness. It's a statement of fear. I could never do this. When you claim your agency, you do it. In fact, it's a tragedy to not do it. We have a company we work with that's a very profit-focused company. And on Monday, all the executives come in and they say, our place is, I hate the boss. I hate him. And then we start, Kim Cameron gets up and puts up those beautiful pictures of his, and they say, this is totally irrelevant. It would never work here. And they go on and on about that. By the end of Tuesday, someone, every single time, whispers, oh, my unit looks like that. And I say, what? And I make him speak up. And then I ask him, I just pound on him with questions until he or she paints the whole picture. Now here's the positive deviant. In the company where it can't happen, there it is. Now everybody else in the room is in big trouble. One more story. Having everything to do with what I'm talking about now and about what you can do. I have a friend, his name is Larry Dewey. He's a psychiatrist. He just retired. He spent his life in one of the darkest hierarchies on this planet. It's called the Veterans Administration. So it's not only a federal agency, it's one of the darkest of the federal agencies. I once worked with the senior leaders of that organization. It was like being at a dentist having a root canal all afternoon. Because they didn't believe anything could happen. Larry Dewey was hired in a little tiny town called Boise, Idaho. He was in charge of the mental health extension system. And he did a very curious thing. It looked a lot like the picture up on the screen. Larry Dewey took a piece of paper and he said, this is my dream. The dream looked a lot like social excellence. And he said, this is my value set. These are my deepest values around leadership. Things like, I need to respect you in every interaction. I need to build trust. List went on. Then he did an astounding thing with this piece of paper. He handed a copy to every direct report. And he said, your job is to hold me accountable. If at any moment, in any interaction, I'm not living these things, you are to call me into account. Now that's very simple. It's inside a zone of control. Easy to understand. When I laid out for executives, no one buys it. I couldn't do that. That's a great test of integrity. Am I really a leader of my unit? Do I care more about the welfare of the unit than I do for my own ego? That's what that thing is testing. Now here's the interesting thing. Now remember, what agency was this? His boss comes to him after 3 years and says, Larry, you're the luckiest person I've ever met. He said, well, why's that? He said, the biggest problem in mental health and the Veterans Administration is we can't get good people. You've got the best people I've ever seen. I've never seen someone so lucky in hiring. After a couple of decades, Larry noticed this pattern. Every year, when there's any budget increases at all, Boise, Idaho gets one every time. So he asks about it. And they said, oh yeah, we get more bang from the buck for Boise, Idaho than any other unit in the entire federal agency. Larry Dewey is not the CEO. He's not the secretary, the head of the agency. He's this lowly mid-manager in the middle of the dark bureaucracy. If you look across the last 18 years of research in positive leadership, we find the positive leaders everywhere. You heard the stories about the custodians. Jane and some other folks did that first study. Custodians leading at the hospital, changing patients' lives. And when she went to their bosses and said, what do you know about these folks? The bosses were totally impervious, just had no idea there's any difference between their custodians. The point is that anybody, in any context, Kim and I spent a lot of time in Detroit public schools. Makes the Veterans Administration look like a Disney World. But we found people in that cesspool who were positive leaders. It's not about your context. It's not about your boss. It's about your agency. And there are two transformations. One, you have to start learning from excellence. And science says you can't do that. You've been trained to learn from failure. You have to make a decision to see things other people can't see. Number two, you ask the question that changes everything. In other words, you take accountability for the fact leadership produces excellence. It usually doesn't. I believe many CEOs are not leaders. They're managers. But after 18 years of doing this, I am absolutely convinced that it's a personal decision. So if you've been here and you felt inspired by the ideas that you've obtained here, don't look at the other people. Don't look at your boss. Don't look at the hierarchy. Go home and look in the mirror and ask yourself, what's my purpose? Did you notice how important that was to Scott? And he says, I have to renew it every day. So I go to graduation. I build in these renewing moments. What is my purpose? What's my mission? Why am I on this planet? You've got to know the answer to that question. That's where courage comes from. That's where commitment comes from. And when you answer that question and you claim your agency and you become like Scott, now your job is to create a context in which other people can understand social excellence, believe in it, and lead for it. 99 times out of 100, it won't happen. Or I should say it doesn't happen. It's all about being number 100. Can you create more excellent conversations? Right now they happen by accident. Can you make one happen every week? Would that be possible? Marriage. When I have people answer the marriage questions, I get so depressed because I am such a loser, right? Because it's such hard work. But it's really clear to me that it's possible. Team, organization. I think that that's what this is all about. I started doing that exercise by accident. It was an intuitive experience. I just said, I think I'm going to try this. And every time I ran it, I said, there's something really important here. I don't quite understand what it is yet. And after doing it, suddenly these two notions crystallized. We're discovering social excellence, making it possible to learn from it. And when people learn from it, they can ask a question that's about agency. Can we make it happen? I believe, I am sure, you can make it happen. You may have to make the journey Scott made, but you can make it happen. It's my hope that everybody in this room will contemplate that and make some decisions that will make it happen. Thank you.
It's all about agency. I just want to point out that I had my agency affirmed. There is a Yoda on the poster over there. Okay, from here we're going to have a break for 30 minutes. You'll come back here at 3:15 for our final keynote from Ari. I encourage you to come and hear Ari, and also Chris is going to get tested because Chris has to introduce him, and his last name is not the easiest to do. And to give you a sense of the details of that, we, in preparation, Angie gave us a list of everybody's name and phonetically how to pronounce them, except for Ari. Ari, we got a video on how to pronounce Ari's last name. So Chris, the pressure's on you. So 3:15 back here.